All right. Last but not least in Unit 1 is Learning Target 10. Learning Target 10 deals with membranes in the body. So an important thing to know about the human body is it's packed, it's condensed. There's a ton of stuff inside there. If we were to look inside your abdominal cavity or abdominal pelvic cavity, there's a bunch of stuff all packed into this tiny little space. So these membranes are important. They're going to offer protection. They're going to offer lubrication and keep all the organs um, lubricated. Sorry, but also it's going to kind of separate so each of these organs can work individually. So the stomach, even though it's lying right next to the diaphragm and right above the small intestine, is separated by its own membrane from those other organs, so it can function independently. So all these membranes we're going to talk about are serous membranes. The serous membrane are just all the membranes inside the body that are going to cover the organs. But when we hear that word serous, they're going to produce this stuff called serous fluid, which is just this lubricating fluid within all of our body cavities. There's two types of membranes that you're going to have to know, and you're going to have to, excuse me, remember these words: parietal and visceral. Okay, so parietal is going to be a membrane that covers the cavity, not necessarily wrapping around an organ, but it's covering the cavity or the inner wall of the cavity. Visceral, we've heard that term before, viscera. Viscera are all the organs in the body. A visceral membrane is going to attach tightly to the outside of an organ, so it's going to cover an organ. So those are two big things, parietal and visceral. So anytime you hear parietal, it's a membrane that's lining the cavity. Anytime you hear visceral, it's a membrane that's covering or lining an organ. And then in between the parietal and the visceral membranes, we have a cavity. Okay, so that's usually going to be something we just call a serous cavity, or it might be depending on the area. So we're going to see in a minute the pericardial cavity is this cavity between the membranes that surrounds the heart. And then here, like I already mentioned, these are always filled with this serous fluid. It lubricates, reduces friction, adds protection. This fluid around our organs is extremely important. Really, nothing inside the body is dry. We always want this serous fluid lubricating our organs. So it's kind of like this. Okay, so let's pretend your fist is an organ and you're going to put a water balloon around your fist, right? Okay, so the part of that water balloon that's going right around the fist there, that would be the visceral membrane. Okay, visceral because it's covering or attaching directly to the hand or to the fist. Then we have this area here that's filled with the fluid. That's going to be the cavity between the two membranes. And then this part, this is going to be a parietal membrane. Parietal because it's lining the cavity that we're going to be in, which we'll get to those in just a moment. All right, so you can see the examples here on the lungs. On the lungs, you see the fist would be the lung. The membrane that's covering right around the lung is going to be your visceral membrane. And then there's going to be another membrane that's lining the cavity. That's going to be your parietal membrane. So keep that in mind. Keep this diagram in mind. We're going through the rest of these slides. So let's start with the thoracic cavity. First, in the thoracic cavity, we have something right in the middle of the thoracic cavity called the mediastinum. That's going to contain the heart. The esophagus is going to pass through there. The descending aorta, which is this branch off of, see that big thing right there? That's the aorta. It's going to go down behind the heart. All this stuff is within the mediastinum. So the membranes in this area are going to be called pericardium. Cardio, you probably heard the word cardio, right? Cardio, we're around the heart. So our first one is the visceral pericardium. Another word for it might be the epicardium. This is a membrane that is directly surrounding or attached to the surface of the heart. How do I know that? Well, I see the word visceral. Visceral, remember, meaning organ, so it's right around the heart. I have the pericardial cavity. Let me come back to that. The parietal pericardium. Well, visceral means around the organ. Parietal, it's going to line the cavity. So the parietal pericardium sorry, is superficial to the pericardial cavity or, farther away from the heart. So it's going to line the inside of the mediastinum. Okay. However, around the heart, we're going to see a third one here in just a minute. Okay. So I have visceral, then I have parietal. In between those two, I have the pericardial cavity. That's filled with a specific type of serous fluid called pericardial fluid around the heart. And then finally, around the heart's kind of important, so we protect the living you-know-what out of it. So we put it in the thoracic cavity, surround it by ribs, put it behind the sternum, put it within the mediastinum, and then give it 3 membranes that surround it. So our third membrane around the heart is the fibrous pericardium. Fibrous pericardium is a thicker third layer that's actually on the outside of the parietal pericardium. Okay, this provides extra protection. So the heart's special. This is not going to be the same for all other organs. So I have the heart or the organ, right? Then I have the visceral pericardium that's right around the heart. That's going to surround the heart and attach to it. I have the pericardial cavity, which would just be the space between. I have the parietal pericardium. And then I would have a third fibrous pericardium that's surrounding the heart on the inside of the mediastinum. Now, if we stay in the thoracic cavity, well, we have this area around the lungs. These are called pleural cavities. So I have a right and a left pleural cavity that contain both the lungs. So within the pleural cavity, I have pleural membranes. Okay, these surround the lungs within the thoracic cavity. So again, think of the vocabulary. I have a visceral pleural membrane. Visceral pleural is going to be directly surrounding the heart. Okay, so it'd probably be this little thin red line right there. Not the heart, the lungs. I have the pleural cavity, which again, we'll come back to that in a minute. And then I have the parietal pleura, or the parietal pleural membrane. Parietal pleural membrane would be this blue one right there. That's on the inside of the pleural cavity. Okay, and going back to the pleural cavity, that's the space between the visceral and the parietal, and that's going to be filled with that serous fluid, or pleural, a specific type called pleural fluid. Abdominopelvic cavity. Now we're going to see some new vocabulary here. We see something called the peritoneal membrane. This is specific to the abdominopelvic cavity. The peritoneal membrane are all the membranes within this abdominopelvic cavity, anything within the abdomen or the lower pelvic cavity down below. So again, thinking of the vocabulary, visceral meaning surrounding organs. The visceral peritoneum covers all of the organs within the cavity. I have a peritoneal cavity, which we'll come back to. And then I have a parietal peritoneum. This lines the walls. Okay, so see this blue line that goes all the way around the cavity, kind of almost forms one big membrane all the way around. That's going to be the parietal peritoneum. Each organ would have a visceral peritoneum surrounding it. So, stomach, liver, gallbladder, spleen, kidneys, everything would have a visceral peritoneum surrounding it. Mesenteries, we'll see that here in just a second. Okay, so just a quick review. Visceral meaning or surrounding organs, parietal meaning lining the cavities. If you think of those terms and then know the location, so if I'm in pericardial cavity, I know I'm around the heart. Pleural cavity, I'm around the lungs. And then peritoneum, I'm in the abdominopelvic cavity. And then last but not least, we have these things within the abdominopelvic cavity called the mesenteries. Okay, when we dissect our cats, you will see the mesenteries very clearly. Basically, the mesenteries take all of your intestines and organs.
Everyone, good morning. Once again, welcome to Old Tansy Berlin High School for today's convocation. Mr. Meyer is so excited that you're here. We're all excited.